I would like to thank you for coming in this frightful weather. We were hoping for a full house, but in the circumstances, I think this is a very good turnout. Direct democracy pros and cons is something that has been hotly debated in Iceland for the last few years. And we have been lucky enough to get Mr. Bruno Kaufmann to give us a little insight into his work and to put the discussion in Iceland in a little bit of a international perspective. Jón Ólafsson, most people know from the academic community in Iceland, and he has specialized in political philosophy and has especially specialized in pragmatism and democratic theory. So I'm not going to speak here. I'm not the main attraction, so I'm going to just ask you to listen to these fine fellows, and then afterwards we will have a discussion, and it seems we will have quite a good time for discussion, since we could use the opportunity to have some questions and discussion for maybe until 1:15 or 20 minutes past 1. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Bruno Kaufmann. Bruno,
thank you. Thank you very much. Everybody has this little handout. There are some new people in the back. So thank you very much, Johannes. I'm very glad to be here today with you, and I'm again and again experiencing what it means to not to be able to plan too much ahead. Every time I'm coming to Iceland, I'm asking a few days before, how will the situation be? And everybody says, no idea. And even for politics, this is very often the case. And things are happening on a day-by-day basis. And this is, of course, very impressive for somebody coming from Sweden and Switzerland, where, for instance, in Switzerland, the dates for the next referendums are already set 35 years ahead. The calendar is clear. And where in Sweden, my colleagues in the Election Commission get very stressed when they know that the next election is 2 years ahead. And you obviously have, in the last 4 years, learned to be very dynamic when it comes to organizing votes and elections and popular votes and referendums in a much more flexible and a much more dynamic way that we are used to that in countries like Switzerland and Sweden. But still, of course, even in these countries, many things are going on, many things are happening when it comes to the practical use of modern democracy, and that's a little bit the issue of today, because you are in a very dynamic phase regarding your own democracy. You have experienced many up and downs, many new ideas, many new practices, and as I have, as a journalist, political scientist, and also political practitioner, I'm currently a member of a local government in Sweden. I have followed and observed and monitored and researched around these issues for about 25 years all over the world. I'm very much interested in what's going on here, and I had the privilege in the last 4 years to come here about 10 times, and also to meet the people from Iceland in other places many times in these years. So I feel a little bit privileged in being so closely involved and monitoring what's going on, and also, of course, following the discussions about the new constitution. Typically, in an academic context, one would start with the principles, the ideas of democracy, then go to the procedures, and finally look into the practice. I would like to do it vice versa in my introduction. I would like to start a little bit with the practice, then discuss the procedural features, especially now in the discussion here in Iceland, and finally have some remarks about the principles of a modern democracy. I just wanted to start a little bit with a report and an insight into the popular votes of last Sunday in Switzerland. That's the reason why you have got these handouts, because it's a very illustrative case of using the tools of initiative and referendum in a country where, as you know, the practices have been quite extended and quite long in comparison to most other countries. Last Sunday we had in Switzerland hundreds of local popular votes, referendums and initiatives, and also in the states, in the 23 states of Switzerland, but also 3 national popular votes on substantive issues, which in a way covers all the setting of instruments you can imagine when it comes to a modern direct democracy. On this handout you can see 3 maps. 3 maps covering the 3 different votes. The biggest map is the all-green map, which is referring to a popular initiative which was already started about 8 years ago by an entrepreneur, an individual, who was very angry about that in the big companies, the big bosses could get golden parachutes and millions of euros in salaries without really delivering results. So this guy started in 2006 a popular initiative where he proposed a limitation of the possibilities to pay such money in stock market registered companies. And the starting point maybe was a case where a Swedish big boss of a Swedish company, ABB, Percy Barnevik, which you may have heard about, got 148 million Swiss francs when he stopped his job. And he found that a very reasonable pay for stopping the job, but not everybody found, of course, that was a good idea. And this initiative started at that point of the time. This initiative was gathering signatures for about 1.5 years. In Switzerland, you need 100,000 signatures within 18 months to qualify for a popular vote. So this was manageable. While this initiative then was sent to Parliament, to government, as the normal procedure is, when you have an initiative qualified, the Parliament and the government are able to put their recommendations on it. They're also able to put counter-proposals on it. So in the end, you would have different variants or different possibilities to vote on. But this initiative was really into the heart of the Swiss, you can say, liberal economic model of free businesses. So both parliament, most parties, big businesses were very much against this radical approach to limit the pays for the so-called fat cats, as it is labeled here. And the initiator, Mr. Minder, who was behind this initiative, he was a very lonely man, and he was a very angry man also, because he was not only angry about these payments, he was also angry about the treatment of his initiative, because it was prolonged and prolonged and prolonged. If you discuss these issues in Parliament, if you put forward a counter-proposal, it can take up to 8 years from the initiative start to the end, to the popular vote, as it was last March. But as the irony of history sometimes is, he got really the perfect timing. He got the perfect timing because, of course, the financial crisis in Europe and the world have changed the mood of most people when it comes to this type of free payments to big bosses. And he especially also got the good timing because one of the best paid managers in Swiss economic sphere, Mr. Vasella from the company Novartis, 2 weeks before the vote announced that he would get 72 million Swiss francs for not doing anything more after he quit his job. That is called to not be allowed to work for another company. So in the end, when this initiative was voted on Sunday, in fact, there was the initiative on the table of the initiator, but also a counter-proposal, an indirect counter-proposal by the Parliament, who was also against these payments. And but which was not at the vote because it would have been put into force if the initiative would have been voted down. But as you can see in this result, this initiative got a very high approval rate of 67.9%, and this is in fact the third biggest approval rate for a citizen initiative in Switzerland in all history. You see down on the page, on the left corner down, you see a list or a table of all popular votes, national popular votes since 1848. With these 3 votes this weekend, we have had 586 such votes. And if you see this number, of course, you could say that that's a long time. There has been many votes during a long time, but myself, I have participated in almost 300 of these votes. So you can see how much more voting has been developed in the last decades. Also, you can see on that when you go to the line of the popular initiatives, that out of these 183 or now 184 popular initiatives, only about 10% have been approved by the people in a vote. So it's very seldom that the popular initiative really can make it to the majority when it comes to the majority of the people and the majority of the states. And that's one of the features in Switzerland, that all changes of the constitution have to be approved by both dimensions, which means the absolute majority of the people and the absolute majority also of the states. Here on this page also of the votes of last week, and you can also see another case, it's the smaller map on the right side. It was a proposal by the parliament to change the Swiss constitution in order to make the support for families a national federal competency. And here you can see that in this vote, in fact, 54% of the Swiss people voted yes, but only 10 out of 13 states, which means that this approval wasn't accepted because the majority of the states didn't allow it. This was the second vote, and the third vote, which is even a more specific map on this, you can see it's a law about zoning law, which means that it's a law which limits the possibility of municipalities and states to plan for buildings, for construction across the country. Switzerland is a small country. It's less than half of Iceland, but it has almost 8 million people living there, and about 2/3 of the area isn't possible to build on. So it's a very small area you really can build, and there, of course, territory which can be used for construction is very expensive. And so different municipalities and different cantons started to be extensively zoning in such parts into their plans, which obviously was in favor of the construction business and certain people. And this has created a lot of criticism, and this law now limits this possibility to zone, to plan for construction outside the already zoned areas. And as you can see on this map here, just one state, the state of Wallis, voted against this law. 80% of the people voted against, and this is also the canton where, of course, the most zones were be put for construction and where the construction business had a very important influence. But you can already see on these 3 maps, you see a country where this voting shows you a lot of differences, a lot of different opinions, and also in a way how these decisions are representing the Swiss people in very different ways. It's not always the French-German part, Catholic, Protestant, urban, rural part. These maps are changing all the time. And this is a very specific element of the Swiss political system, that even so, in most cases, of course, laws are made by parliament. About 3-4 times a year, there is a checking point where people have to discuss issues which are seen as of specific importance. It's the instrument of the citizen initiative, as I have said, 100,000 signatures within 18 months, and then the possibility of a counter-proposal by parliament. It's the popular referendum, which gives the people the right to put all parliamentary decisions to a popular vote, which is 50,000 signatures within 100 days. and it's also the mandatory constitutional referendum, which means that all changes of the constitution have to be decided by the people and the states by majority in order to get its legitimacy. When it comes to the practice of Swiss direct democracy, you can say that it's a very integrated part of the political system. It's not something which is on the side of indirect parliamentary democracy. It's in fact a very much integrated part within representative democracy, which allows for a fine-tuning of representation, and also, I would say, makes the representative democracy of Switzerland more representative, because it's mirroring much more clearly how the people are looking and supporting different types of legislation and constitutional changes. In practice, you can say that in Switzerland there is a hierarchy of the different legislative normative levels. Constitutional issues are always popular issues. It's always to be decided by the people. Legislation normally is the area of the parliament, of the delegated power. Only in certain cases, if you make a referendum, these are put to a vote. And norms and regulations normally are the concern of the executive, of the governments, which only in very, very few cases can be put to a vote. Something which is very often, you can say, discussed in the Swiss context or even in the international context is when you are comparing participation or turnout between elections and popular votes on substantive issues. And as you can see on this list here, of course, when you look on the historical line, you see that 100 years ago, turnout in general was much higher. But that was a time where very few people, in fact, were allowed to vote, only male above 25 years. The notion of the people, of course, have changed very profoundly in Switzerland in the last 100 years, as in most parts of the world. So younger people, female voters, even partly non-Swiss voters are today allowed to vote in popular votes on different levels, which creates, of course, a much bigger electorate. At the same time, as I have said, we have seen an enormous amount of votes coming up. As I have said, I have participated in almost 300 national votes, thousands of state and municipal votes. So the opportunities to participate are much higher. And in the end, today, there is a clear reference to that in Switzerland, at least 81% of the people participate in one vote once a year. So when you have votes, as last weekend, when the turnout on the national level was 46%, this is a quite average part of the participation. Over 1 year, about 81% are participating at least once. So what we could see and learn from the Swiss case is really the factor that these direct democratic elements are, in fact, a very much integrated part of the whole democratic system. They are a key part of it to make it more representative. And also, you can say the political parties, of course, through this growing use of direct democratic elements, have changed their role, not mainly as decision makers, but mainly also as facilitators of decision making, which means that the political parties and the politicians are very much challenged to be convincing when they are presenting a legal project, for instance, as they know that each legal decision they are making can be put to a vote. Of course, they have to be very clear in language. They have to be very convincing in presenting it, because in fact, of course, they want to avoid a referendum. And in most cases, in 9 out of 10 cases of a legal decision in Parliament, this is never put to a popular vote. And when it is put to a popular vote, it's about, as you can see on this list, 55% of these projects pass the vote, 45% are rejected. Finally, you see what is also a very important learning process in the Swiss direct democratic system is the role of the counter-proposal, which creates the possibility to choose when you have a vote between a radical, for instance, initiative proposal and a less radical proposal by Parliament. And normally then, as you can see in this case, 57% of the counter-proposals are accepted. There are many other aspects about the fine-tuning of this system and the interaction between indirect and direct democracy, which could be discussed more in depth. But I would like from this now go to the more procedural aspects when it comes also to your own project of making your democracy, you can say, more representative and more democratic by introducing certain aspects of direct democracy. These articles 65 to 67 are, of course, you can say, a very interesting starting point for discussing that, because they are in fact enlisting all the basic elements of a modern direct democracy, including the possibility for referendums, legislative referendums, but also citizens' initiatives in different ways. But of course, it shows also that when there is little practice or no practice almost, there is also a risk that things are in a way put together in a way which are not really maturated to support the democratic system and the democratic decisions. And just looking into these different articles, one thing is, of course, the language, but I understand that the translation may be also a little bit confusing and your own terminology may be more precise. But of course, when petitions and initiatives and referendums and plebiscites and everything is put into the same use, of course, that may be very confusing, because normally a petition is something which you can just ask for, where you don't have any formal rights, while an initiative normally is seen as a more formal right of a certain amount of the people to be part of a formal process of agenda setting and decision making. This as a general note. When it comes to the Article 65, and here I just want to give let you know some of the reflections I have regarding these proposals. One can, of course, see that once that you have this specific element of a referendum, which does not make. I mean, it's like with a presidential a referendum. You have, as long as there hasn't been a vote, the decision made by Parliament is still in force, and this can be, of course, a little bit of a problem when a law is in force and then is repealed afterwards. So there can be a phase of uncertainty, which is very problematic. You could also say it maybe would make more sense to just let the law becoming law when all these check and balances are over, which means if there is a certain amount of time available to the people or the president to question a parliament decision, the decision should be put into force of the law after this phase. What is also a little bit special in this law is that the parliament still have a right to withdraw during this phase of a referendum, during these 3 months or even this 1 year to the vote. So even here, there is a little bit of an unclear role how the Parliament can still be in action during this phase, and of course also these uncertainties of the legislative proposal also makes it open to political games and instrumentalizations, which are maybe not very helpful for the political debate. Because in the end, of course, all these instruments are there in order not only to make a decision more legitimate, but also to make it more transparent, to promote dialogue between the different stakeholders in a polity. So the unbalanced right of certain actors in the process to use it as a certain instrument for their own interests is sometimes a little bit problematic. When it comes to Article 66, which has, of course, also here a very specific title, is basically about the different types of citizens' initiatives. In this proposal, there are two elements of a citizen initiative. There is a you can call an agenda initiative with 2% of the electorate, which is basically just the same as a motion or an initiative of an individual or a few parliamentarians to put an issue on the agenda of the parliament, which is something which exists in many places all over the world, for instance, now also on the European level. As you may know, on the European level we have since 2 years ago a European Citizen Initiative, which gives 1 million people the right to put an issue on the Commission's agenda. But the other thing here is, of course, the full initiative, which gives the citizens the right to propose their own laws. And also here you have the counter-proposal of the Parliament, which in that way you can say is very much similar to what Switzerland also use. There are, even here, you can say certain unclear factors, like for instance that the Parliament themselves can decide if an initiative, a vote about an initiative and a counter-proposal should be binding or non-binding, and this is of course something which I would say is very, very problematic. It's like when you have a parliament election and then somebody is to decide if this election is binding or not. Seems to be a very odd element of political decision making to have such a way of declaring something non-binding, even so the process is very clear. I think the time frames are reasonable, and also what is important here, I think there are no specific turnout requirements. This is also something typically when you introduce these rights, that there are certain hurdles to try to make things non-working, is for instance to say that only 50% of the electorate is participating, a vote is valid. This is of course giving those who are not participating the right in fact to make the decision, because the non-voters and the no-voters in the end are counted together, and this is avoided in this, and this I think is a very positive element. What we then have also is Article 67, which is also a very strange element in a way here. On one side, the articles proposed want to give a clear indication about the instruments at hand. On the other side, here we got into the regulation and of when and how this type of initiatives and referendums can be used. And it's a little bit in the hierarchy of the norms here we have a certain problem. And especially also, of course, here again we see an imbalance between the Parliament on one side and the electorate on the other side, that certain issues which are within the competence of the Parliament are suddenly excluded, and these are not by accident maybe the issues which are normally mostly the issue of popular votes. For instance, in Switzerland and other countries, that you are voting about the money of the people, the tax issues, about international law like the ISAF agreement, or issues regarding naturalization and citizenship. So I'm in an international comparison very much skeptical about trying to avoid issues which are of most interest and relevance to a democracy from this type of process. So in the end, you have here with these three proposals, and it's also complemented with the old right of the president to put an issue to a vote. You have basically a layout of possible instruments. You have also a layout of possible additional hurdles, and you have a layout of imbalances. So in the end, all this should obviously be developed much better in a more clear hierarchy and in a more clear legislative proposal or constitutional proposal. Finally, I would say also there is a risk that only certain issues are here regulated, while others are given to a parliament for their own decision when it comes to how the procedure is made. Because, for instance, time factors are very important. The ways how you can gather signatures are very important. All these aspects are decisive for the usefulness of direct democratic instruments. I have experienced in many, many countries that the principles are agreed about, that direct democracy is part of modern democracy, but then in the regulations, in the design of the instruments, there are so many hurdles, people wouldn't use it at all in the end. And that's, of course, not the purpose of such a democratic reform. I would say that what would be now important in Iceland is to agree on the principles of these instruments and to introduce certain rights which make direct democracy really part of it, but then it would be necessary to develop and to discuss how it can be done. There are a lot of reference points, not only to Switzerland, of course. The Council of Europe has developed a list of good practices of initiatives and referendums. There are international expertise available. But in the end, of course, every country has to embed this type of elements in its own legislation. So let me conclude with a few remarks about the issue of direct democracy in our democracies as such. I mean, it's sometimes really a confusing debate when you discuss that people would say that direct democracy is outside representative democracy, and then saying representative democracy is basically indirect democracy. It's just you give away your vote, and the vote is taken care about by delegated people. And if you look into the practices and the use of these instruments all over the world, in fact, it's not at all that case. I mean, assessing all constitutions of the world, 8 out of 10 constitutions of democratic countries do know some forms of direct democratic elements in their constitutions. More than half of the democratic countries in the world have the principle that the constitution is the issue of the people themselves. That means every change of the constitution has to go through a popular vote. And thirdly, you can see an enormous development towards greater use of direct democratic elements all over the world, which means that the modern representative democracy of today is very much based on the principles of the protection of the rule of law, of the right to delegate powers to parliaments and governments, but also by the principle of participation. Because this check and balance in the end goes back to the very idea of a democracy, which is decision-making after debate, after dialogue. So the people are not just able to express what they think, but they have also the right to be heard. This is an extremely important aspect, which in some, you can say, limited indirect democracies today are very much not seen as so important anymore, or most people don't feel that they are really heard. So I'm very happy that you in Iceland have, in a way, after being a little bit after some of these developments in many, many years, now have made a jump into the middle of this debate and this development of modern democracy. And I really think that if you are able to integrate these forms of direct democracy in a fine-tuned, well-designed way, your representative democracy can become much more representative in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Mr. Kaufmann for his lecture. Please write down your questions, and we will take questions after both the lectures. Please welcome Mr. Jón Ólafsson. Okay, yeah, there's this. Eitthvað að fara í gang. Já. Hann ekki að fara í gang? Okay, well, let's hope the picture appears. But I just want to start with taking up what Bruno ended with, which I very much agree with, that we cannot and shouldn't make this very clear or clear-cut distinction between representative and direct democracy. This is all very much tied up together.
and there is more and more demand for any kind of representative democracy to include different ways of ensuring public participation. Yeah, okay. Okay, good. So what I want to do is to talk about this in maybe a little bit more general terms. My title is "Are Referenda a Good Way of Involving the Public in Politics?" But I really want to ask some questions about what it means to involve the public in politics. And we could also say, in some ways, referendum is a way to have public view without involving the public in politics. I mean, sometimes you would want to check views and have views of the public without making people go the extra step of participating in debates or something like that. But if we think about this, participation and questions like why involve the public? What is the use of it? Why should we do it? Why not just have representative assemblies like the parliament make all the decisions? And the questions we of course have to ask is, first of all, is it likely to improve decision making? Are the decisions supposed to be better if the public is involved? And are decisions so made, or is it likely to make public decisions less contested? And of course, we could answer these questions separately. Many people think that involving the public is not likely to make the decisions better, but it might make them somehow easier to be agreed upon because they're made by the public, but think that some other, like committees of experts or something like that are much more likely to make good decisions rather than the public. So the question is about public participation, is it dangerous? And I think, as Bruno said, this is not the reigning view today. People generally think that involving the public is not dangerous, but in many cases, the way the public is involved evokes questions. And I think everyone will agree with me that when the idea of creating a constitutional assembly and having it actually make a new constitution for the country was discussed to begin with, many people expressed doubts about doing it in a way that would make the constitution written by the assembly sort of a binding document, and thought this was, well, how do we know what is going to come out of it, and so on. So there was clearly, and there's always, when talk is of ways of involving the public, there always comes up the idea that this might have bad consequences. So the question really often becomes, when this is discussed from an administrative or sort of the public administration standpoint, is yes, of course we should involve the public, but let's make the process, let's design the process in a way that reduces the uncertainties and dangers that the public might actually make some crazy decisions or something like that. So I think we should distinguish between two kinds of involving the public, which is I think very important to do. On the one hand, we have decision making, involving the public in making decisions actually, and on the other hand, we have ways of involving the public in policy making, and these are quite different things. If we first look at involving the public in decision making, this might be thought of in two different ways. We might think about decision making in an aggregative way, which a binding referenda are the best ways of thinking about that. Aggregative means that we are not proposing a question for discussion to the public, but a question is proposed which is then actually voted on. So the only thing you want to do is to check what are the views right now about this particular issue, and then you have a referendum on it, and it's binding, and that decision is made by the public in that way. You could also think about electronic voting, electronic democracy, which very many people are quite interested in now, the simplest and the crudest form of e-democracy simply consists in a way of aggregating very quickly opinions and use them. And again, if we're talking about a decision process like this, that would mean that we have some way of just throwing out a question and having the public decide upon it. Now, then there is something we could call national fora or national congresses and something like that. And these might be much more deliberative. You would actually you might collect together a big group of people. Might be 300, might be 1,000, something like was done here 2 times, 2009 and 2010, and ask these people actually to somehow decide upon something. And this might be done in different ways. The interesting thing about the national fora that were held here, of course, was that they were supposed to, it was a very interesting mixture of sort of policy and decision-making involvement, because these national fora were supposed to make decisions. I mean, this is a little bit ridiculous when you put it that way. They were supposed to make decisions about what were the core values of Icelanders. You might say, well, can you really make decisions about that? So of course it was supposed to affect policy making, but it was a little bit organized, as if they were to make clear what were the core values of Icelanders. And of course these core values turn out to be so general that in the end, of course, it doesn't really mean anything. But a national forum might also be a way to involve the public in decision making. And then, of course, citizens' assemblies, where you have maybe an elected assembly like the Constitutional Assembly was supposed to be, that's then entrusted in making decisions that are not, for some specific reason, supposed to be best made by parliament, government, or someone in the administration. And then we have something that's quite new. I think the word is maybe just a few years old, something called crowdsourcing. And crowdsourcing is really just any way of involving the public in making any kind of decision. And I think it's maybe the most interesting way of thinking about public involvement right now, because you could think about small problems and bigger problems, big decisions and smaller decisions, that you somehow design a decision-making process where the public electronically or in whatever way are involved, and you really try to figure out what a crowd or what the public thinks about some issue, and you can have some deliberation about it or not. There's really no fixed method in how you go about in doing this. So we have various ways of involving the public in decision making, and some of these ways are, you could say, aggregative in the sense that you just measure the majority sort of viewpoint, or they are deliberative in the sense that you expect large or small groups of people to come together and discuss, or have some perhaps electronic means of exchanging opinions and something of that sort. And it's also interesting that sometimes these methods are put sort of as opposites, deliberative methods and aggregative methods. But you really see, and the crowdsourcing example is a good example of that, I think, that you really can't have only one of these methods. You usually, if you are making some sort of public involvement, you really have to have both. And the older idea of democracy, where you simply think of democracy as a way of getting the opinions, rather than actually creating a forum for people to change and develop their opinions, is, I think, also a little bit outdated. The deliberative idea of democracy, of course, assumes that you will always have people who are prepared to change their opinions if they are in a setting where they are actually discussing these things and so on. So much about the decision making ways. Now, if we think about policy-making ways of involving the public, we can also have aggregative and deliberative methods. A non-binding referendum, for instance, would be a way of involving the public in policy-making, checking somehow the views of the public without having the public make a decision, right? And sometimes, for instance, when we think about the referendum about the constitutional proposal in the fall, it was clearly a non-binding referendum. So the question, of course, is if you have a non-binding referendum and you don't act in accordance with it, are you then shunning the majority view of the population? Obviously not. You are not doing that unless you're actually having a binding referendum. But a non-binding referendum would somehow be supposed to influence the policy-making process and have an influence on what people then discuss. Now, polling of various kinds, obviously, is also a kind of public consultation when you have a representative sample and you check the views you get there. NGOs and discussion groups are also a way of it, and you see in legislation, both here, but especially I think in Scandinavia, that there is more and more sort of formal requirement for the administration to seek views of NGOs and to involve NGOs in decision making. And of course, when the parliament goes through all kinds of consultations with experts and groups and so on before a legislation is passed, that's also public consultation, clearly. Now, the national fora and other kinds of organized group consultation would also be policy-making consultation, clearly, or could be, if these things are done in a way to actually seek involvement or seek views and discussion from the public that is then used to influence policy-making. And then crowdsourcing, I put this in brackets because really the way this concept seems to be used is more about decision-making than policy-making. And then I want to mention at last one more thing, which is so-called deliberative polling, which has been experimented with a lot for the last 20 years, perhaps. This is a method where you actually get together a group of people and you have them discuss an issue for some particular time, and then you actually poll them. So you mix together sort of polling methodology and deliberation, and the actual interest in this method is to see how views actually change if you have people discuss them. So for instance, you would have, let's say you would have a poll first, and you see what the views about the Constitution or whatever are. Then you have a certain subset of the originally polled sample come together and discuss the issue, and then you poll them again, and you see how the views have changed. Originally, this was used to show that deliberative democracy actually does work, that people actually change their views when they have an opportunity to. And people who believe in this method, they would say that what you get from the poll after the deliberative meeting is the views of the people you would get if everybody was informed, and so on and so forth. So this is also an interesting way of public consultation which influences policy making rather than presenting an alternative way of decision making. And actually, if this is used in a proper way, you would say that an assembly, a municipal council or the parliament, so on, if it uses methods like this, it would have to somehow take them into account in policy making. So if we think about the Icelandic constitutional draft in this sense, it really presents an attempt to involve the public in various different ways. First of all, there is the selection of assembly members, which was an election of a body that was sort of outside of parliament or official structures. Then there is the method of work that the assembly actually uses, or the council as it became, which was its sort of own invention, and then there is consultation with the public, which was quite sort of used during the work of the Constitutional Council. So the criticisms that the product then gets is of three, or the criticisms of the Constitutional Council is really of three kinds. First of all, the product is criticized, the method is criticized, and the legitimacy of the process has been criticized. And the question is really here, like I said in the beginning, if we are thinking about public consultation, we have to take it from these two perspectives. Are we expecting the decision made or the outcome to be better than if public consultation is not used, or are we expecting it to be somehow less contestable? And the idea of epistemic justification of crowdsourcing methods really would sort of go so far as to say that you have to have both. The procedure is important, of course, but only if it supports the quality of decision making. And the question is, would crowdsourcing offer better possibilities than traditional referenda or polling? And I think when we are talking about the Icelandic constitutional draft, this is really the important question. Should we think that the methods used to create the document give us any sort of guarantee or hope that this is a better document than it would be if it were made by experts or by parliamentarians? And that is, of course, the big question now. So I think if we are thinking about the constitutional draft as it looks right now, we have elites pointing to uncertainties in the interpretation of new articles. And it was interesting to hear how critical Bruno was of the particular articles that you were discussing here right now, which I think might be, well, the translation might be a little bit problematic of them. Sometimes sounds a little bit stranger in English than it does in Iceland. And then the question for epistemic Democrats, or for those who believe that consulting the public or using methods that we could call crowdsourcing, whether these methods will actually make up or give us better documents or better legislation. So the question would really be, was the bill adequately crowdsourced, or is it simply an alternative created by a different elite? And I think this is really, when we are discussing the constitutional document, this is really something that we have to think about. The discussion here in Iceland is very much focused on the flaws in the actual document. And if you read the articles through, you can certainly criticize them. Most of them you can criticize, and most of them severely. So people tend to think, well, this shows us actually that doing it this way is just wrong. It doesn't work, right? We should have, although this is maybe not expressed very clearly, we should have entrusted a group of experts to do it, rather than these people who didn't know how to write a constitution. They did it all wrong. And that would be sort of the elite argument, that if you go through the various meetings that have been held here in Reykjavik about the document, this is exactly the kind of argument you get. So if we go back and say, well, maybe we should not look at the articles themselves. We should look at the method of making it. Would it somehow make it likely for us that to think that the constitutional bill as it is now is a very good document. And I think this question is totally impossible to answer. So given all this, I forget to. If we think about the constitution making as an exercise in participatory or direct democracy, what does the experience show us? And I think, unfortunately, if it ends like it seems to be ending right now, with the draft actually simply put aside to wait until after the elections and so on, we will never know. The only thing for us to know is to try how it works. And I would say about the articles that have to do with national referenda or public direct democracy as they are put in the constitutional bill itself, they have been criticized for going a bit too far. And I guess, something like saying that the 10% threshold is too low is probably right. It should be a little bit higher. That there are dangers that somebody could hijack, public opinion and so on. But I would still think that the articles in the Constitution about referenda are just the barest minimum that you would really need in a constitution like that. A better thing would be, and maybe this is something that should be in the Constitution, or one would hope would result from the actual debates that the new articles in the Constitution would lead to if they were to take effect, which unfortunately they will probably not do, would be to ask whether there are other ways of direct democracy than referenda that might be better, more useful, or more interesting. And I think the problem with policy making versus decision making is this, that somehow it seems to be the direct democracy seems to require participation in decision making, and this is what the constitutional articles about national referenda also sort of confirm, that direct democracy is involving the public in decision making. But there are various ways of influencing policy making which might be more useful or more interesting for various reasons. The problem is only that if you're only involving people in policy making, if their view is only going to have a consultatory sort of effect, they will not feel empowered. You need to actually give decision-making power to people in order for them to feel empowered, naturally. But the reluctance of entrusting big questions to the public will always be very great, as we see with the constitutional with the fate of the constitutional issue. The city of Reykjavik is doing something right now, which is to have people actually choose projects that are then financed. People you get direct participation in actually ranking projects. So you are making decisions on how funds are distributed. But the criticism that you hear of this is very, very simple. People say, well, what does it mean to participate in voting on streetlights or on whether the playground is there or there? These are all small decisions, and so it's really difficult, I think, to create a system of public consultation or public participation that is both meaningful for those who participate in it and also useful for actual policy making by representative bodies. So I think I should stop here. Thank you.
much. We now have some time for questions, if you like, and just I think we'll take a round of questions and then have a round of answers. And if you want to have another round of questions, we'll do that if we have time. Yes.
I actually have more of a collection of points. Regarding Article 65, the clause that says that Parliament may repeal the legislation before the referendum takes place, that actually has a very clear explanation, because this is a direct result of what happened in, I think, 2004, with media law, in which the government decided to repeal a law that was scheduled for a referendum. The referendum never took place, which is almost definitely a violation of the Icelandic constitution, but that's a different issue entirely. Secondly, what I find interesting is that there always remains the assumption that decisions need to be taken on a centralized basis. Why should this be? Why shouldn't we extend the principle of subsidiarity to within the state, into the state, all the way down to the level of the individual? That seems to me to be the most, the most obvious way to actual direct democracy. It's not really direct democracy as such is not a goal, it's a tool. The actual goal is the right to the self-determination of each individual. So, yeah. Yeah, let's think of that.
Anyone else? Not at the moment. Yeah.
And just a very quick question, because Bruno Kaufmann said several times that these direct democratic elements are about making representative democracy more representative. Representative democracy isn't representative enough as it is. These Icelandic reforms, constitutional reforms, could be a way of making Icelandic democracy more representative. Is the ideal to strive for than a truly representative democracy, or is it something else?
Could we start with some comments on this? These two?
Yes, maybe starting with this point. I mean, this is really. I mean, this explanation about how direct democracy can make representation or representative democracy more representative is, of course, the end of a discussion about these issues, because very often when you discuss that initially, you are starting from a normative idea of democracy, which means people power, which in reality, of course, is always light years away. And this difference between the idea and the reality, of course, creates a lot of both frustrations, hopes, practices, historical experiences, where you can see that in this struggle about making democracy a little bit more democratic, or closing the gap a little bit more, because there is always a gap, there is always an impossibility to make really all decisions totally democratic in a way that everybody can be involved in everything. For practical reasons, for time reasons, for resource reasons, you need forms of shortcuts. You need methods to come to an end with a decision-making process. And in this perspective, when you look how direct democracy in this way of initiatives, referendums, basically voting rights on issues is shortcutting the process. It's always about how representative, how good represents the decision made in a polity, in a community, the views, the differences, the variety of a society. And in that way, when you look concretely into how these instruments work in different parts of the world, it's really about making representation more representative, because the representatives have to listen much more, they have to convince better, they have to understand their issues much better, because they have to go out and explain them. I mean, there is a nice research, for instance, about European treaty making, where you have a German parliament deciding about the Maastricht Treaty, and when they are asked, the individual MPs, about what's in this treaty, 98% have no idea, basically, because their experts in their parties are preparing that and making, we are deciding. So when you have, like in France and Denmark and Ireland, if you have a big debate, if you have a vote on it by everybody, of course it's a much more comprehensive process where the representatives have to go out and make their voices heard vis-à-vis the people. So in that way, you can see that in direct democracy's most important effects is on indirect democracy, because even so, when you know as a legislator that this law, if we are not doing a good law which is comprehensible, which is convincing, certain groups in society will have the right to put it to a vote, and we want to avoid it. So you discuss with them already during the process in Parliament. So the Parliament is extended towards the whole society in order to avoid the referendum. So you can really see that this type of elements, when they are fine-tuned and not just brutally contrary like you have in certain US states, they are really supporting that. And then it comes to the idea of autonomy and the different levels. I'm absolutely agreeing with you that, I mean, the democratic idea is about, on one side, autonomy, my own power, and on the other side, the sharing of power in certain communities. And of course, different countries are very differently. I mean, Switzerland is an example of a country which never have been a monarchy. So the source of legitimacy have never been with the king. It has always been with the individual people or groups of people and elements of states. So that's maybe also a little bit, I must say, the difference in rhetorics. When you say we involve the public, in Switzerland you cannot say that. I mean, we are the sovereign, so we are delegating certain competencies to certain groups of people in parliaments or governments. But we would never say we. I mean, who is we? If we are not the people, if we are not all the citizens who are the sovereign in a democracy and can choose to delegate certain aspects to a more central power or to a certain amount of delegates. But this is always preliminary, because the source of sovereignty in a democracy does not disappear with a vote. So in that way, I would say, it's clear that the notion of individual autonomy on one side and sharing power on the other side in communities is the necessary picture. Otherwise, you have like in an economic world, everybody can be free as an individual doing what he or she wants. But in politics, freedom is done by acting together, and you need the instruments to act together. And that brings me finally to the big picture you have also described, in a way that you can say that you need these formal forms of co-decision. I mean, if you never are allowed to elect your representatives to parliament, why should you be interested in follow what they are doing? Why should you be interested in checking them if you don't and never have the right to be involved in choosing who are there? And that's the same thing with the issues, that you can be consulted, you can take part in any internet forum, but if you never, ever have the right really to be involved in the decision making, the democratic aspects of it, the real democratic aspects of power sharing are of course not there. You could even see a dictatorship consulting with the people, and they can petition them whatsoever. But in the end, it's the individual person or the individual government who makes all the decisions. So it's a question of perspective, which brings us all time back to the essence of democracy, which is people power, and which is basically, as long as you are striving for democracy, it's not something to negotiate about.
I think going to the original question, Max's question actually, the idea of making representative democracy more representative is, in my view, a little bit of a code saying making representative democracy more deliberative and more participatory. Because if you I mean, in the various technical details, representative democracy simply means that representatives are elected to make decisions, right? So if you, well, that's sort of the simplistic part of it, let's say.
Very simplistic.
I'm not saying that's right. That's the simplistic way to look at it. But that's also true. I mean, representative democracy is affected by electing representatives who then are supposed, at least that's part of what they're doing, is to represent the electorate in different ways. There was one criticism of the Constitutional Council that it was actually not representative enough, meaning that it didn't represent the different constituencies and different groups in the country. For instance, that there were only 3 people there representing rural areas, let's say. So this is one way of talking about representing something. But I think when you are talking about making representative democracy more representative, I would think of it like making representative democracy more participatory and more deliberative, which means that you have and you have very many different methods of doing so. And I agree with you, of course. I mean, nobody can talk about, you know, we the king who make the decisions and the public who then might affect it or have some influence on them. So I think the question is really whether actually involving others, let's say, than formal assemblies in making decisions is the best way of public participation. And I think the first question here about whether what we actually mean by direct democracy, and that in the end what you want to have is the decisions being made on the lowest possible level, preferably on the individual level. On the other hand, you also have, there are public decisions made, right? They are made by parliaments, or they are made by referenda, they are made in various different ways. And the question is, what are the different ways to affect them or to make them? And referenda is just one way to do so, but I think consultatory methods, like for instance deliberative polling that we discussed a little, are also very good methods to do so. They are not perfect, and of course, as you say, you know, any dictator could use such methods to legitimate his or her decisions, like Hitler made Volksabstimmung in Germany to legitimate certain decisions made by the state. But on the other hand, they can also be a way of influencing policy making in the level before they are actually brought into a decision-making process, which I think is very important. And that comes to another problem, which I think is something we have to think about when we are talking about public participation, and that is public apathy. If you go around in Iceland and ask people what they think about the constitution, not very many will think anything about the constitution. I don't know if that would, how large a percentage that would be.
What was the turnout in the vote?
Well, the turnout was better than many expected. It was almost half. It was good, but very many people will not have strong opinions on the constitution. They will even tell you directly that they don't care. And I think if you want direct democracy, you would need not only to go with decision making on an individual level, you would actually need to have living public interest in the decision on the individual level, and that's something we are quite far from having in our modern democracies, unfortunately.
Yes, my name is Thorstein Magnusson. I'd like to first thank you for good talks, interesting subject. There's one question that I would like to ask, and that is about the bill that is being discussed for our new constitution. And there are certain exclusions, subjects which would not be subject to referendum if the people ask for referendum. And that is issues like issues concerning fiscal budget and undertakings under international law. I would like to hear your view. Perhaps you mentioned it before. I had to leave for a while in the room, but if you not mentioned it in the lecture, in the talk, do you think there is a necessity to exclude these issues totally from this article of referendum. I have in mind this Icelandic dispute that was. We had this referendum, and that concerned largely fiscal budget. And beforehand, many might have argued that it was, and people argued that it was an obligation leading from international law. So that would have been excluded from this article. So I'm concerned to hear a view on if it's necessary to exclude issues like that.
Yeah. Well, my view is that well, I must confess I'm not entirely sure about what I think about this, but my instinct is that there shouldn't be any exclusions there. There should rather be the process should rather be thought of in a healthy way, so that you wouldn't have to fear that the public will go mad and demand that some crazy things be done, right? I think that it's a little bit problematic to have to exclude things like that from the decision that the public can make. But your question brings me to another point, which I think is I think a very serious criticism of the way these things are thought. And the thing is that we have gone through certain conflicts between the parliament on the one hand and the president or the public or whoever on the other, where the idea somehow becomes that to give the public some rights over decisions made by the parliament, you have to create a situation where the parliament does something that the public opposes, right? So here in these articles, this is very, very clear that the public is given rights to, which used to be sort of only in the hands of the president, to oppose the parliament and somehow nullify what the parliament does. And I think this is a very strange way of a very strange and a negative way of bringing out the public will. Why put it in a way that you would somehow expect this conflict or opposition to be the main source of interest among the public to do something? So yeah, that's my view.
I think there are. It's a typical way of trying to counteract the principle of power sharing when it comes to direct democratic instruments. We see this type of exclusions in many countries. I mean, most Eastern European constitutions which have been established after the Cold War included the right of initiative and referendum, and they were established through the constitution, and afterwards normally the parliaments changed this law in a way to exclude basically all issues of interest, which is it's an expression of this power struggle between the sovereign as such and the representatives on the other side. And in principle, it's of course a crazy idea that the citizens are smart and legitimate enough to elect representatives, but then suddenly they should be less competent to be able to vote on certain individual issues. This is a very strange way of disappearing democratic legitimacy through an election of somebody else. I mean, it's almost seen as a machine that if somebody is elected by the people, he suddenly gets like much wiser or more competent than those who have elected him. So this is a principal aspect. Procedural aspect is of course a big risk that when you have this type of exclusions, that there is always a struggle about, is this now influencing the financial monopoly of the parliament, or is this now something which has to do with international law? So it's a big risk that you never have this deliberation which is welcomed and wished and entitled through this process, but you have a legal fights between those who want to limit the citizens' influence and those who want to empower it. So it's an unlucky way, and practically you can say that where these rights are a natural part of the decision making also by the people, it's often a very useful way. I mean, we had just last weekend in Switzerland dozens of popular votes on tax issues, and because just now is the mood of you can say not limiting the state too much. The state is under and the public sphere is under big pressure. So all these votes to limit or to reduce taxes have been voted down by big majorities, even in states and municipalities where you would expect that people wouldn't, of course, not like to pay more taxes, but they are in favor of even higher taxes some way. So it's a way to make the tax level more in phase with what the people really wish. And you can also show in the Swiss case, but even in the American one, where you have this type of decision making by the people on these issues, the tax evasion, for instance, is much less, and the use of public money is much more efficient than if you have only the representatives to make the decision about these key issues. So it's even for practical reasons a very good way of including the sovereign and the people into the decision making.
I think it's just that the limitations, they are an expression of administrative fear of having the public make decisions. I mean, that's simply what it is, and they show actually that even though there are articles about direct democracy, there is really no trust in that. There's always the fear that something crazy will be decided.
But then you have always to ask, if somebody, a representative says to me, people cannot be trusted, the people are not intelligent enough, then I always say, and these unsmart, untrustful people have elected you. I mean, then the whole idea of representation and representative democracy is falling down, because basically those who are electing somebody, cannot be trusted.
Well, the answer would be if I answered, be the representative of Europeans, say, well, they elect me because I'm so bright, I'm so intelligent, they know I will make the best decisions. So
maybe the choice is not too big,
So I think we have run out of time. Thank you for coming here, and thank you, Bruno and Jo, for very good discussion and good lectures. The lectures will be available online at Lagastofnun, the Institute of Law. So we hope that will be up soon and will be advertised there. Thank you very much for today.
Thank you.